He wanted to humiliate her in front of the whole class, but a minute later he regretted it. What happened the moment she took to the keyboard? Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The classroom hummed with the low murmur of students settling into their seats, backpacks thudding softly against the linoleum floor, the occasional rustle of notebook pages flipping as someone hastily reviewed their notes before the lesson began. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the room, making the whiteboard gleam too brightly at the front where Mr. Beckett stood, already shuffling through a stack of papers on his desk. Iris sat in the farthest row, near the window, where the light filtered in through the dusty glass, casting faint shadows across her desk. She had long since learned that the best way to survive this class was to be unseen. Not that it was particularly difficult. People didn't pay attention to those who didn't demand it. And Iris had never been the type to demand anything. She kept her head down, her fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern against the edge of her desk, a habit she had never quite broken. No one really noticed her. She wasn't like Mark, who always had his hand raised before a question was even finished, his voice brimming with barely contained arrogance. Or Lisa, who could recite lines of code as if she had memorized an entire textbook and reveled in the attention it brought. They were the ones Mr. Beckett favored, the ones he always called on, always praised, the ones who existed. Iris, on the other hand, existed in the margins, not because she wasn't capable, but because it was easier that way. She had learned long ago that it was better not to draw attention to herself. When she was younger, teachers had underestimated her, assumed things about her before she had ever spoken a word. Too quiet, too detached, too different. And over time, she had stopped trying to prove them wrong. Mr. Beckett was no exception. He rarely called on her, and when he did, it was with a certain edge to his voice, a barely concealed doubt that made it clear he expected very little. Sometimes it was a passing comment, a subtle jab disguised as a neutral statement, the kind that made other students smirk while she remained silent. Other times it was the way he never quite looked at her the same way he did the others, as if she were an afterthought rather than a student sitting in his class. The lesson began as it always did. Mr. Beckett launched into his lecture, writing a few lines of pseudocode on the board as he explained the logic behind today's assignment. It was a challenging one, a debugging exercise where they had to find the errors in a pre-written program. He glanced at Lisa and Mark, almost as if he was already expecting them to solve it before anyone else had the chance. Iris listened, but didn't take notes. She didn't need to. The problem was simple enough. She could already see where the logic had gone wrong just by glancing at the board. It was second nature to her, the way code fit together, the patterns that formed beneath the surface. She didn't raise her hand. She never did. A few rows ahead, Mark and Lisa were already discussing possible solutions in hushed voices, both of them eager to be the first to solve it. Mr. Beckett watched them with thinly veiled amusement, his usual smirk forming as he walked between the rows of desks, glancing over shoulders, making occasional comments. He ignored Iris entirely, as expected. She exhaled quietly and turned her gaze back to the window. Outside, the trees swayed slightly in the wind, the golden hues of autumn just beginning to creep into the edges of the leaves. The world beyond the glass felt distant, quieter, more bearable than the noise of the classroom. But then something shifted, a presence, the unmistakable weight of attention turning in her direction. It was subtle at first, but she felt it before she even looked up. Mr. Beckett had stopped near her desk. It took her a second to realize why. His eyes flicked down toward her notebook, and only then did she notice she had been absent-mindedly jotting down the corrections to the faulty code while lost in thought. She quickly closed her notebook, but it was too late. He had seen. A slow smile curved his lips, though there was nothing kind about it. It was the kind of smile that suggested amusement, but not in a way that was pleasant. It was the smile of someone who had just discovered something unexpected and was deciding how best to use it. He turned away without saying anything, continuing his slow path through the classroom, but Iris felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. She wasn't sure why, but something about the way he had looked at her made her stomach twist. The class continued as normal, at least for everyone else. For Iris, the air felt different. He had noticed her, and she had spent too long perfecting the art of being invisible to believe that this was anything but the beginning of something she wasn't prepared for. So she did what she always did. She stayed quiet. She kept her head down, but she knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be enough this time. The hum of the classroom settled into a steady rhythm as Mr. Beckett turned back to the whiteboard, his marker gliding across the smooth surface as he outlined the details of the day's task. The scent of dry erase ink lingered in the air, mingling with the faint musk of old textbooks and the metallic tang of overheated computer monitors. The lesson had only just begun, but there was already an undercurrent of tension in the room, the kind that came with a challenge no one was sure they could meet. Iris kept her gaze fixed on her desk, but her ears absorbed every word. She knew how this would go. It was always the same. Mr. Beckett would introduce an exercise, the class would stumble through it, and eventually Mark or Lisa would rise to the occasion, their egos swelling under his approving nods. The rest would either struggle in silence or quietly resign themselves to mediocrity. Today's assignment was a debugging challenge, a seemingly simple program that contained a critical flaw. The students were expected to find the error and fix it, but the problem wasn't just a misplaced semicolon or a forgotten bracket. It was deeper, woven into the logic itself, the kind of flaw that required not just knowledge, but intuition. Iris glanced up as the code appeared on the projector screen. It was long, unnecessarily convoluted, filled with nested loops and conditional statements stacked in a way that made her fingers twitch with the urge to fix it. She could already see where it had gone wrong. The redundancy in the loop structure, the way an improperly initialized variable was causing an infinite recursion. It was messy, but not impossible. Mark let out a low whistle from a few seats away. "Damn, this is brutal," he muttered, nudging Lisa with his elbow. She adjusted her glasses, tilting her head slightly as she scanned the screen. "It's tricky, but doable," she replied, her voice brimming with the quiet confidence that Mr. Beckett so often praised. "Just need to break it down logically." Mr. Beckett turned, his gaze sweeping over the room with a knowing smirk. He lived for moments like these, where he could watch his students squirm under pressure, where he could weed out the competent from the mediocre. He always presented himself as fair, as someone who encouraged growth, but Iris knew better. He didn't want them all to succeed. He wanted a select few to shine while the rest floundered in their shadows. "You have 30 minutes, he said, stepping back from the board. "Work individually or in pairs. First one to get it right earns extra credit." The shuffle of keyboards and clicking of mice filled the room as students dove into the problem, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens. Lisa and Mark immediately began strategizing, their voices a low murmur as they sketched out potential solutions. Others hesitated, staring at the screen with furrowed brows, unsure where to begin. Iris didn't touch her keyboard. She didn't need to. She leaned back slightly, arms crossed, letting her eyes trace the patterns in the code. It was second nature, like reading a familiar language. The infinite loop in the second function, the unnecessary recursive call, the poorly optimized conditionals. It all stood out like neon signs. She could fix it in less than a minute, but she didn't move. No one expected her to. Time stretched on, the tension in the room thickening as frustration set in. Mark swore under his breath as his screen flashed another error message. Lisa pursed her lips, deleting and rewriting lines of code with increasing urgency. A few students had given up entirely, their fingers idly scrolling through their notes, hoping for a sudden revelation. Mr. Beckett walked between the rows, observing with his usual detached amusement. He paused now and then, offering vague hints or nudging students in the right direction, but his real interest lay in the ones who struggled the most. And then, as if by instinct, his gaze landed on Iris. She wasn't typing. She wasn't even pretending to. He stopped beside her desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The room hadn't noticed yet, too absorbed in their own failures, but she felt the shift, the weight of his scrutiny pressing down on her. "Not even going to try?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Iris didn't answer right away. She knew this game. He wasn't asking because he wanted her to participate. He was asking because he wanted her to fail. She shrugged, her fingers tapping idly against the desk. "I see," he mused, his smirk widening. "Well, some people are better suited for simpler tasks. Not everyone is meant for this level of thinking." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. The intent behind them was clear, sharp enough to cut. A few nearby students glanced over, sensing the undercurrent of something they didn't quite understand. A flicker of amusement crossed Mark's face, and Lisa shot a glance that was equal parts pity and condescension. Iris's fingers stilled. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from something colder. Anger. Not the reckless outward kind, but the kind that settled deep, the kind that simmered just beneath the surface, waiting. She knew what he was doing. She also knew that, in his mind, he had already won. Because she wasn't supposed to be capable. She wasn't supposed to be better than the ones he had already chosen as his favorites. She wasn't supposed to matter. Mr. Beckett let the moment stretch just long enough to solidify his point before he turned away, already dismissing her. "Let's see if anyone else can figure it out," he said louder now, addressing the rest of the class. 10 more minutes. Iris exhaled slowly, staring at the screen. The answer was right there. She could fix it. She could end this whole thing in seconds. But if she did, he wouldn't just be surprised. He would be furious. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if that was exactly what she wanted. The last few minutes of class stretched into something heavier than time, weighted with expectation, frustration, and the simmering energy of competition. The quiet hum of fingers striking keyboards was broken only by the occasional muttered curse or the exasperated sigh of a student realizing their solution wasn't working. Mark and Lisa were still deep in discussion, hunched over their screens, their voices low and urgent. Others had abandoned any hope of solving the problem, their gazes drifting toward the clock, waiting for the lesson to end. Iris hadn't moved. The cursor on her screen blinked, waiting for input, but she ignored it. She could still feel the lingering heat of Mr. Beckett's gaze, the way he had looked at her with something just shy of amusement, as if she were little more than a background character in a story he had already written. His words echoed in her mind, deliberate and cutting, a dismissal more than an observation. Some people are better suited for simpler tasks. Not everyone is meant for this level of thinking. She knew what he had meant. She had spent her entire life hearing versions of that sentence in different voices, wrapped in different tones. Sometimes it was blunt, an outright assumption that she wasn't capable. Other times it was softer, more insidious, hidden beneath a layer of false encouragement. You should focus on what you're good at. Maybe this isn't for you. Have you considered something easier? She had learned early on that proving people wrong wasn't always worth it. Some minds weren't built to change, but sitting there with the answer so clear in front of her and Mr. Beckett's condescending smirk still etched into her memory, she found herself wondering if, just this once, it would be. The room shifted subtly as Mr. Beckett checked the time. The tension in the air thickened, anticipation curling at the edges of silence. No one had solved the problem. Even Mark and Lisa, the undisputed stars of the class, looked uncertain now, their confidence eroding with each failed attempt. Mr. Beckett seemed pleased, as if their struggle confirmed something he already believed. Then, just as he opened his mouth to speak, Iris moved. She sat up a little straighter, fingers finally resting on the keyboard, and without hesitation, she began to type. It took her less than 20 seconds. The rhythm of her keystrokes was smooth, deliberate. She erased the redundant loop, rewrote the conditional statement, and adjusted the recursive call, all in one fluid motion. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause to second guess. She had seen the flaw the moment the problem was introduced. This was just execution. The final keystroke was followed by silence. She didn't announce it. She didn't need to. The moment her screen flashed confirmation that the program was running correctly, a ripple of awareness spread through the room. A few students turned, brows furrowing as they registered what had just happened. Mr. Beckett's head snapped up. For a second, just a second, his expression faltered. Then, with deliberate slowness, he walked toward her desk. She didn't look away from her screen as he loomed over her, the glow of the monitor casting faint shadows across his sharp features. He leaned down slightly, just enough to read what she had done, his eyes scanning the corrected code. His jaw tightened. "Interesting," he said, and there was something in his tone, something strained, controlled. "Let's see if it actually works." He reached past her and pressed a key. The program executed again, seamlessly, perfectly, without error. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the expectant quiet of students waiting for instruction. It was the stunned, breathless kind, the kind that followed a realization that something fundamental had just shifted. Mark sat frozen in his chair, his fingers still hovering over his keyboard, his mouth slightly open, as if he had been about to say something but had forgotten what. Lisa adjusted her glasses, blinking rapidly. A few students exchanged glances, unsure whether they had just witnessed something impressive or impossible. Mr. Beckett straightened. His face was unreadable, his posture stiff, as if he were physically restraining himself from reacting. He exhaled through his nose, slow and measured, before turning back toward the front of the room. "Class is dismissed," he said. The words cut through the silence like a blade. The students hesitated for half a second before the usual rustling began. Backpacks zipping, chairs scraping against the floor, footsteps echoing as they filed toward the door. The murmurs started before they even reached the hallway. hushed voices carrying snippets of disbelief. Iris didn't move. She could still feel eyes on her, but she kept her expression blank, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Applause? Acknowledgement? She should have known better. As the last student left the room, Mr. Beckett turned back to her. "Stay behind for a moment." She didn't react, didn't let anything slip, even as the door clicked shut behind the final student. The room felt colder now, emptier, the hum of the computers suddenly too loud. Mr. Beckett's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes told a different story. "You've been holding back," he said, not quite a question, not quite an accusation. She didn't respond. He studied her as if seeing her for the first time, as if up until now she had been a placeholder, a background figure, something unremarkable. And now that image had cracked, revealing something he hadn't anticipated. He didn't like being caught off guard. He took a slow breath, then exhaled. "Tomorrow," he said, "you're going to show the class what you can really do." A statement, not a request. She met his gaze for the first time since the challenge had started. Something flickered between them, something tense, something unspoken. Then she nodded. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. Iris walked home in silence. The afternoon sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long, stretched shadows across the pavement. The weight of her backpack barely registered against her shoulders, her thoughts too tangled to care about the familiar discomfort of the straps digging into her skin. She replayed the moment in her mind, the stunned silence of the class, the way Mark had frozen mid-gesture, Lisa's glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose as she stared. And then there was Beckett, standing stiffly at the front of the room, his mouth forming words that had carried an edge of something just beneath the surface. "Tomorrow, you're going to show the class what you can really do." She shouldn't have cared. She shouldn't have let it bother her at all. It was a mistake, stepping into the spotlight, even for just a moment. She had spent years perfecting the art of blending in, of letting people assume what they wanted to assume. Being underestimated had its advantages. It kept her from the exhausting cycle of proving herself over and over again. It allowed her to work in peace, to exist outside the expectations that always seemed to weigh her down. But she had reacted, let herself slip. And now Mr. Beckett had seen her. Her house was empty when she got home. The quiet was familiar, predictable. Her mother worked long hours, and by the time she came home, she would be too tired to talk about anything beyond the essentials. It suited Iris fine. There was a comfort in solitude, in the predictable rhythm of her own space. She dropped her backpack by the door and made her way to her room, shutting the door behind her. The glow of her computer screen greeted her as she sat down at her desk, fingers instinctively reaching for the keyboard. She had an old habit, one that had formed back when she first started coding. Whenever something unsettled her, whenever thoughts felt too large and too loud, she let herself sink into the logic of it all. Code was predictable. It followed rules. It didn't talk back. She opened a blank file and started typing. Not anything in particular, just letting her hands move, tracing familiar patterns, writing snippets of code that looped and nested, building something out of nothing. It was grounding. Her mind kept drifting back to the challenge from earlier. The code Mr. Beckett had given them had been a mess of inefficiencies, redundancies, and bad logic. But it had been deliberate. He had designed it that way, not just to test their skills, but to see how they thought, how they approached problems. It had been a puzzle, a game he expected only a select few to play well. He hadn't expected her to play at all. She still remembered the look in his eyes when he realized she had beaten him at his own game. It had been brief, but she had seen it. That flicker of something, annoyance, disbelief, maybe even something close to anger. He hadn't been prepared for her. That thought sent a pulse of something through her chest, something that felt too much like satisfaction. She shouldn't have reacted in class, shouldn't have let herself be baited. But there was no undoing it now. Mr. Beckett had already decided. Tomorrow he would put her in the spotlight again, and she would have to make a choice. She could mess up, play dumb, let him believe that today had been a fluke, that she wasn't really worth his time. Or she could show him exactly who she was. The thought sat heavy in her mind as she leaned back in her chair, staring at the scrolling lines of code on her screen. She had spent so long staying invisible that she wasn't sure if she even knew what it would feel like to be seen. But maybe, just this once, she wanted to find out. The next morning, the tension in the classroom was palpable. Iris felt it the moment she walked in, the way heads turned ever so slightly, the way whispers rippled through the space before quieting just as quickly. She kept her expression neutral as she took her seat, setting her bag down without a word. She could feel Mark and Lisa's gazes on her, both assessing, both trying to fit her into whatever box made sense to them now. Mr. Beckett didn't acknowledge her immediately. He stood at the front of the room, flipping through his notes, his expression unreadable. When the bell rang and the last student settled into their seat, he finally spoke. "Before we begin today's lesson, let's go over yesterday's assignment." His voice was calm, controlled. As most of you know, no one was able to solve the problem in time. He let that hang in the air for a moment, letting them feel the weight of it. No one except Iris. Her name landed in the room like a dropped coin. The weight of every glance shifted to her. She kept her eyes on the desk, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. Mr. Beckett turned to the projector, pulling up the same problem from yesterday. The flawed code flickered onto the screen. "Iris," he said, and this time there was something pointed in his tone. "Come up here and explain your solution." She stood, moving slowly, deliberately. The whispers had stopped. No one was smirking now. She reached the front of the room, and for a second, everything felt too bright. The glow of the screen, the attention pressing in from all sides. She exhaled once, then turned to the board. Her fingers moved with precision as she rewrote the key sections of code. She spoke as she worked, her voice steady, measured. The problem was in the loop structure. The logic was inefficient, which led to an infinite recursion. The original code had an unnecessary condition that created redundancy. Once you optimize the function call and adjust the variable initialization, the output executes without error. She finished typing and stepped back, letting the corrected code settle on the screen. The silence in the room stretched. Then Mr. Beckett moved, approaching the screen, his hands in his pockets. He studied her work, his jaw tight, his expression carefully neutral. "Run it," he said. She did. The program executed flawlessly. A small sound escaped from somewhere in the room, a sharp breath, a disbelieving exhale. Iris didn't turn. She didn't need to see their faces to know what they were thinking. Mr. Beckett nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Impressive," he said, but there was something clipped in his tone, something forced. He turned back to the class. "This is what efficiency looks like," he said. "Some of you should take notes." She knew in that moment that she had done more than just solve a problem. She had changed something, and Mr. Beckett wasn't happy about it. The weight of the moment didn't lift as Iris returned to her seat. The silence wasn't quite the same as before. Not the expectant hush of people waiting for something to happen, but the kind that settled over a room when something had already changed, and no one was quite sure how to react. She could feel the eyes on her, some fleeting, others lingering, like Mark's, who sat hunched over his desk, fingers lightly tapping against the edge, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Lisa was watching her too, though her expression was more thoughtful, less closed off. Others were harder to read, their faces blank with surprise or quickly turning away as if unsure whether acknowledging what had just happened would make it more real. Mr. Beckett didn't say anything for a moment. He stood at the front of the room, his gaze still on the screen where Iris's corrected code remained. The flickering glow cast sharp shadows over his face, accentuating the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed ever so slightly where they rested at his sides. He hadn't expected this, not from her. The realization settled deep in her bones, heavy and undeniable. She had seen the flicker of resistance in his expression, the brief tightening around his mouth when the program had executed flawlessly. He had wanted to find something wrong with it, some reason to dismiss it, to tear it apart. But there hadn't been anything to criticize, because she had been right. And now he had to decide what to do with that. "Let's move on," he said finally, his voice even, controlled. He tapped a few keys, clearing the screen, erasing the proof of what had just happened as if removing it from sight could change the fact that it had been there at all. "We'll be working on a new problem today, a more advanced one." The tension in the room shifted, an unspoken understanding settling over the students. This wasn't just a lesson anymore. It was something else. A test, maybe, or a challenge. Mr. Beckett began explaining the new assignment, but Iris only half listened. She could still feel the energy lingering in the air, the quiet hum of something unresolved. She knew what had happened today wouldn't just fade into the background. It wasn't just about the code. It was about expectation, about perception, about the way people decided who was worth noticing and who wasn't. And, for the first time, she had forced them to see her. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Mr. Beckett kept glancing in her direction, small flickers of something unreadable crossing his face when he thought no one was watching. When the bell finally rang, releasing them into the hallway, Iris gathered her things slowly, waiting for the usual rush of students to clear before she moved. But before she could stand, a shadow fell over her desk. Mark. He stood there, arms crossed, his gaze sharp, assessing. He didn't speak right away, just studied her like he was trying to figure out if she had always been this person, or if she had just appeared out of nowhere, fully formed. Finally, he huffed a short breath, shaking his head. "Didn't think you had it in you," he muttered, but there was no malice in it, just grudging acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the throng of students outside. Lisa hesitated a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Then she simply nodded, almost to herself, before following after him. Iris exhaled slowly, adjusting the strap of her bag before slipping into the hallway. She had expected something more questions, more doubt, maybe even more resistance. But maybe it was better this way. Maybe it was enough. For now. The next few days followed a strange rhythm. People weren't sure how to treat her. Before, she'd been easy to categorize, quiet, distant, uninterested. Now she was something else. Some students started paying attention when she spoke, glancing in her direction when Mr. Beckett posed a question, as if waiting to see if she would answer. Others ignored her even harder than before, pretending as though nothing had changed, as if refusing to acknowledge her meant that the shift hadn't happened at all. But the one who changed the most was Mr. Beckett. His lessons became sharper, more challenging. The problems he assigned were more complex, more layered, requiring a level of thinking that pushed the class in ways they weren't used to. He started calling on her more often, not just in the usual way, but in a way that felt pointed, deliberate. He wasn't ignoring her anymore, but he wasn't praising her either. He was testing her, looking for weaknesses, waiting for her to fail. She didn't. Each time he presented a problem, she solved it. Sometimes in silence, sometimes under the weight of his gaze, but always with the same steady confidence. She didn't flaunt it, didn't try to prove anything to anyone but herself. But she knew he saw it, and she knew he hated it. Then came the next challenge. It was a project, an assignment that would require them to work in pairs, creating a program from the ground up. The class murmured at the announcement, already sizing each other up, deciding who they wanted to work with. But before anyone could speak, before anyone could move, Mr. Beckett made the decision for them. "Iris," he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to make the rest of the class fall silent. "You'll be working with Mark." A pause. Then Mark scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Seriously?" Mr. Beckett's expression didn't change. "Is there a problem?" Mark hesitated, glancing at Iris, his mouth pressed into a thin line, but whatever he wanted to say, he swallowed it. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "Good." Mr. Beckett turned back to the class. "You have a week. Make sure your work reflects your best efforts." Iris sat still, her mind already working through the possibilities. She hadn't wanted a partner. She had never liked group projects, never enjoyed the way she was either ignored or expected to carry the weight of someone else's mistakes. But maybe this was better. Because if Mr. Beckett was trying to make her life harder, he had just made a mistake. Because Mark had something to prove. And so did she. Iris expected resistance. It was inevitable. Mark wasn't the kind of person to let something go easily, especially not something that challenged the way he saw himself. And her solving that problem, the one he had struggled with, had done exactly that. For the first time in years, he wasn't the smartest person in the room. The weight of that realization had settled over him like a storm cloud, dark and brewing, just waiting for the right moment to break. She could see it in the way he carried himself, the slight stiffness in his shoulders when he passed her in the hall, the way his eyes flicked toward her every time she spoke in class. He was trying to make sense of her, to fit her into a new category, one that didn't disrupt the world he had built for himself. And now they had to work together. Their first meeting didn't go well. Mark showed up late, dropping into the seat across from her with a sigh, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't look at her, just stared at the blank screen in front of them, tapping his fingers against the desk in a slow, restless rhythm. "So," he said, voice flat, "what's the plan?" Iris didn't rise to the bait. She had expected this, his reluctance, his resistance. He wasn't the type to take direction from someone he didn't respect, and he certainly wasn't ready to respect her yet. She turned her laptop toward him, pulling up the rough framework she had already sketched out. "We start with the structure," she said, keeping her tone even. "Divide the tasks, work efficiently." Mark's mouth twisted slightly, like he wanted to argue but couldn't quite find a reason to. He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. Fine, whatever. Let's just get it over with. They worked in tense silence. Mark's coding style was fast, almost reckless, like he was trying to prove something with every keystroke. He didn't comment on her work, didn't acknowledge when she streamlined his logic or corrected his mistakes. But he noticed. She saw it in the way he hesitated sometimes, his eyes flicking to her screen, the way his fingers hovered over the keyboard just a second longer than necessary before continuing. He was learning, even if he didn't want to admit it. But it wasn't just Mark she had to worry about. Mr. Beckett was watching. His presence loomed over the classroom, subtle but undeniable. He didn't interfere, didn't offer guidance or feedback, but he was always there, lingering just long enough to remind them that this wasn't just an assignment. It was a test. A week passed in slow, deliberate steps. The tension between her and Mark remained, but it shifted, evolving into something different. He stopped questioning her as much, stopped dismissing her suggestions outright. He still didn't like it, but he was starting to understand. She wasn't just good, she was better. The realization changed something in him, though he would never say it out loud. By the time they finished the project, their code was clean, efficient, a seamless blend of both their styles. They weren't friends, but they were something close to functional. And then came the presentation. Mr. Beckett stood at the front of the room, arms crossed as he watched each group take turns presenting their work. He barely reacted to most of them, offering only the occasional nod or neutral comment. Then it was their turn. Iris and Mark stood side by side, their project displayed on the large screen at the front of the room. Mark spoke first, running through the technical aspects, his voice steady but lacking its usual arrogance. Then Iris stepped forward. She didn't speak to impress. She didn't try to prove anything. She just explained, calm, precise, letting the work speak for itself. The program executed flawlessly. A few students murmured, impressed despite themselves. Lisa, sitting near the front, tilted her head slightly, watching with narrowed eyes. But the only reaction that mattered was Mr. Beckett's. He studied the screen, expression unreadable. Then he exhaled slowly, nodding once. "Well done," he said, the words clipped, almost reluctant. It wasn't praise, not really, but it was the closest thing she was ever going to get, and somehow it was enough. As they returned to their seats, Mark muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear, "All right, maybe you're not so bad." She didn't look at him, but she smiled. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but no one moved right away. The usual rustling of papers and scraping of chairs was delayed by something heavier, something unspoken that had settled over the room. Even as students gathered their things, their movements felt slower, as if they were still processing what had just happened. Iris sat back in her chair, closing her laptop with deliberate slowness. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, some fleeting, others lingering, but she kept her gaze down, focused on the desk in front of her. She had been prepared for this moment after the project, when everything shifted, when people weren't sure what to do with the version of her they had just seen. It wasn't just about the project. It wasn't even about the fact that she and Mark had delivered one of the best solutions in the class. It was about the fact that she had disrupted the pattern, rewritten something unspoken but deeply ingrained. People had underestimated her, and now they didn't know how to see her. Mark was the first to move, pushing back his chair with a short breath, shaking his head slightly like he was still working through his own thoughts. He didn't say anything to her, but as he slung his backpack over his shoulder and turned to leave, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then he gave her a quick, almost imperceptible nod before walking out the door. Lisa left soon after, casting a lingering glance in Iris's direction before following the rest of the students into the hallway. Some of them glanced back as they left, exchanging quiet words with each other, their expressions unreadable. When the room was nearly empty, Iris finally stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. But before she could step out, a voice stopped her. "Iris." She turned. Mr. Beckett was still at his desk, one hand resting on a closed folder, the other tapping absently against the surface. His expression was unreadable, his gaze sharp but not quite unkind. She didn't respond. She just waited. "You've surprised a lot of people this week," he said after a moment, his voice calm, measured. "Your classmates. Mark." A pause. "Me." The admission was careful, reluctant, but it was there. She kept her face neutral, unwilling to give him anything more than necessary. He exhaled, leaning back slightly. "You're good at this," he said, "but you already know that, don't you?" Still, she said nothing. His fingers drummed against the folder once, twice, before he straightened. "Class is over," he said, dismissing her with a small nod. "See you tomorrow." It wasn't quite praise, but it wasn't dismissal either. She turned and walked out, letting the door close softly behind her. The hallway was still buzzing with students, voices overlapping as they moved from one class to the next. But as she stepped into the flow of bodies, something was different. People moved around her differently now. Some glanced her way as she passed, their expressions curious, speculative. Others pretended not to notice her at all, their deliberate indifference making it clear that they had noticed her too much. She caught snippets of conversation, half-heard phrases as students murmured to each other. "Did you see that? She's never—" "Mark, actually—" Beckett looked. It wasn't overwhelming, wasn't loud enough to be confrontational, but it was enough. Enough to know that the shift had happened. She wasn't invisible anymore. Lunch was different, too. Usually, Iris sat alone. It wasn't something she had ever minded. She liked the quiet, the space to think. But today, as she made her way to her usual table, she felt a presence beside her before she even turned her head. "Mark." He didn't ask if he could sit. He just dropped his tray onto the table and sat across from her, exhaling as he peeled open a bottle of water. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without looking up, he said, "So, you always been this smart, or did you just decide to mess with my head this week?" She arched a brow, picking at the edge of her sandwich. "Does it matter?" He snorted, shaking his head. "Guess not." They ate in silence after that. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was something. By the time the day ended, Iris could feel the exhaustion settling into her bones. Not the physical kind, but the kind that came from being seen too much, from occupying more space than she was used to. She walked home slowly, letting the cool air clear her thoughts. She had done something this week, something irreversible. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to undo it. The days following the project were not like the ones before it. Something had shifted, though the change wasn't loud or immediate. It wasn't the kind of transformation that happened in a single moment, like flipping a switch, but rather a slow unraveling of the way things had always been. The rhythm of the classroom had been disrupted, its unspoken hierarchy no longer as solid as it had once seemed. Iris could feel it in the way people moved around her now. Before, she had been invisible, easy to overlook, someone whose presence barely registered beyond the occasional glance. But now, eyes found her more often, lingering just a second longer than before. Conversations hesitated when she walked by, students whispering words she was never meant to hear. Not that she cared. She had never been the kind of person who needed validation, never sought out attention. She had spent too much time learning how to exist without it, how to move through spaces without demanding anything from them. But now that she had been noticed, she realized that being seen came with its own set of rules, a weight that settled over her shoulders in ways she hadn't fully expected. Mr. Beckett's class was different, too. He didn't treat her the way he had before. He still didn't praise her, never acknowledged what had happened in any direct way, but he no longer ignored her. If anything, he seemed almost wary now, his gaze sharper whenever it landed on her, his tone more careful. He called on her more often, not out of curiosity, but out of something else, something that felt like a challenge. He wasn't dismissing her anymore, but he wasn't letting her forget that he was watching. The assignments became harder, the discussions more pointed. And yet, Iris never faltered. Each time he set a problem before the class, she solved it. Not always first, not always publicly, but she knew he saw it. She knew he was waiting for her to stumble, to prove that she wasn't what she had shown herself to be. But she didn't. And that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle him. The other students were a different story. Mark had stopped trying to pretend she didn't exist. He didn't always talk to her, didn't go out of his way to acknowledge her in front of others, but their interactions had changed. They didn't feel forced anymore, didn't carry the same edge of resentment they once had. Sometimes in class, he would glance her way when Beckett introduced a new problem, his expression unreadable but expectant, like he was waiting to see how she would handle it. Lisa had softened too. She didn't outright admit that her opinion had shifted, but Iris could see it in the way she listened now, the way she considered her words before speaking. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it wasn't hostility either. Others, however, weren't so subtle. Some students still avoided her, clinging to the way things had always been, unwilling to acknowledge the change. Others whispered about her, sometimes quietly, sometimes not. A few asked questions, cautious and curious, as if trying to figure out if she had always been this person or if she had simply been hiding in plain sight. The truth was somewhere in between. Lunch was no longer a solitary experience. Mark had started sitting with her, though he never really acknowledged it as a choice. He just showed up, dropped his tray down, and ate in silence. Some days, Lisa joined them. Some days, other students hovered nearby, listening more than speaking, still unsure how to approach her. She let them figure it out on their own, because she wasn't going to explain herself. She wasn't going to justify who she was, wasn't going to make it easier for them to understand something they should have seen all along. She had spent too long being overlooked. She wasn't going to let that happen again. The first real test came a week later. Mr. Beckett introduced a new assignment, one designed to push them further than before. A coding challenge that required them to not only find a solution, but to optimize it, to think beyond the obvious answers. He gave them time to work in class, letting them struggle with it, watching as students tried and failed to make sense of the logic. Iris didn't struggle. She saw the answer within minutes, the patterns forming in her mind like they always did. She could have solved it immediately, could have typed out the solution in less than 5 minutes. But she waited. She let the others work through it first, Let Mark and Lisa piece their way toward the answer. Let Mr. Beckett think she might not have figured it out yet. And then, when the room had settled into quiet frustration, she moved. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, the code appearing in sharp, precise lines, clean and efficient. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the way the room went still as she worked. She didn't have to. She hit execute. The program ran flawlessly. No one spoke. Even Mr. Beckett stayed silent for a moment too long. Then he exhaled, slow and measured, before nodding. "Well done," he said, and for the first time it didn't sound forced. It wasn't praise, not exactly, but it was something close. When class ended, Mark didn't say anything as they packed up their things, but as they stepped into the hallway, he bumped her shoulder lightly with his own. Not an accident, not a challenge, a gesture. She didn't react right away, but later, as she walked home, she realized she was smiling. This was a new reality, and she was ready for it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more videos on the channel for more great content. And don't forget to share this video with others.